morning to not only the panelists, but certainly also the participants who are connected to today's session. I would just like to welcome you with underlining the notion of the conscious inclusiveness policy of cost. We have a long-standing, let's say, tradition to make sure that the excellent proposals that are submitted to us are the point of departure for building a very inclusive network around it of peer researchers and innovators through a period of 4 years and to discover any possible areas to dive into. So that is basically the notion. But inclusiveness in cost has always been, let's say, focused on the geographical inclusiveness. So all the countries, and we have 41 in the meantime, that are member of COST, can nominate participants in the management committees. But COST is, as you may already have learned, is open to also other parts of the world in our direct neighborhood. But in principle, COST has no geographical limits when it comes to participation. At the same time, we are also very keen to be inclusive in terms of gender. And the gender balance track record in COST shows that we have quite a few female participants on average in the action. It's almost at par at the moment, so that's very exceptional. But at the same time, if you look at the proportion of female participants who also have a leadership position, it is not that far off. I think it is something about between 40–45% on top of my mind, but certainly not lower. So that means that there is a very inclusive, let's say, result and representation in the actions at all levels. Finally, I would like to point out that we also pay specific attention to empowering the careers of young researchers and to be inclusive in that sense as well. So we have an approach where the young researchers are also invited before actions are kicked off to come to a leadership training to understand a little bit what kind of leadership roles a COST action has, varying from, let's say, chairs and vice chairs and working group leaders, but also people who coordinate the grants that go to short-term mobility, or the ones who coordinate the training schools, for example, science communication, another important topic, on which we also provide training, by the way, under the umbrella of the COST Academy. These are all different kinds of leadership positions, and the idea is, of course, that these young researchers learn a little bit more about that, but also when it comes to the kickoff of the actions, have not only the knowledge, but also the self-confidence to raise their finger when the action is requiring for volunteers to step forward and to indeed fill those roles. Now, the topic of today is even broader, and I think it's very appropriate. The topic gets a lot of attention in the media, but it of course comes to the practical, let's say, context in order to make it work. So I'm very happy that we have this dedicated session and that we have all of you here to discuss how we can learn and also improve and hopefully also implement in an effective way to make sure that we are even more inclusive. So with that in mind, I would like to wish you a very informative and of course also enjoyable session from my side. So thank you very much again for connecting.
Thank you ever so much. Delighted to be here with you today. I'm going to start by showing my screen here. So I'm Anna Einarsdottir. I am a lesbian and identify as a cisgender woman. I'm a reader in management and at the School for Business and Society at the University of York. And as they said in the introduction, I've also chaired this action into social and economic inequalities faced by LGBTI plus communities. I am immensely grateful to COST for funding this action and to support LGBT plus scholarship. and for enabling us to connect with people across Europe and beyond. Before I hand it over to my capable colleagues, I'd like to say a few words about the action, why we came together, who is involved, and how the action is structured, and what we set out to achieve. As a little bit of backstory to our action, it's fair to say that many of us work in isolation. We're often the only scholars focused on LGBTI plus matters in our school or department. And some of us feel that we can be open about our identities, others do not. For some, this feels perfectly safe, but for others, it does not. As a result, one of the aims of this cost action is to develop strategies to protect colleagues operating in hostile environments, because as we know, the circumstances for LGBTI plus populations across are very significantly. We also want to develop a network to present LGBTI plus research as a viable career path. And I can speak from a personal perspective that I had very little kind of role modeling as I was kind of coming up the ranks as a young and up and coming scholar. So we really appreciate that it's really important to share this as a viable career path. Now, in developing and maintaining an inclusive network, we were hoping, of course, to reach LGBTI plus identifying scholars. And it's fair to say that we have achieved diversity in many areas, particularly on disciplinary spread and geography, but we have been less successful in others. So at the moment, we are currently in the process of mapping the background of action participants to identify and address both overrepresentations of some groups and also underrepresentation. What we weren't expecting, however, was the volume of interest from scholars focusing on cisgender equality. That was something that we really did not kind of think through in the beginning. We also were not expecting the level of interest from people whose primary research focus is not necessarily on LGBTI plus research, but is almost like a side product from their main work. As a result, the action includes both LGBTI plus identifying people and people who do not identify in these ways. Now, in terms of our structure, is a pretty much straightforward type of organization, how we operate. We've got quite a lot of MC members from a number of countries. We have actually at the moment 28 represented countries. And out of these, 15 are from inclusive target countries. And this is quite key for us because we know that a lot of people who operate in these countries, to some extent, there's less acceptance of LGBTI plus realities and less possibilities for funding of research. So we have grown from a very small group of people. We started off by being just 30 of us, and we now include 104 scholars who represent total of 14 disciplines. They are from Europe and beyond. And the way we have organized ourselves is in 3 working groups where social and economic inequalities are most felt by the communities we are focusing on. And you'll hear more from the working group leaders from all 3 groups. The first group is focusing on family and communities, the second one on employment and economic well-being, and the third one on social and legal inclusion. So in terms of, I will finish on this one to say that one of the biggest challenges for us is the lack of LGBT data on LGBT plus identities. And one of the reasons for that is, as many of you will know, is that this group is often referred to hard to research and hard to reach. And what we do know is that sometimes the questions are not asked, or the questions do not actually capture the populations we want to reach out to, or it doesn't even reach the people we want to actually be asking. And the other thing that there is an issue with data overall is the low response rate. We don't always get the right response that we are anticipating. Now, the second issue is that we aim to inform and broaden research in different environments. And this includes where research data is more difficult to acquire and where there's less acceptance. So this is where the ITC countries and other countries come into the forefront. And finally, we aim to interact with a range of stakeholders to identify issues regarding equality for gender and sexual minority to gather social and workplace data. And if you want to reach out to us in any way for advice, support, and collaboration, this is where you can find us. And without further ado, I will hand it back to Cost, who will then introduce the next speaker. So thank you very much.
So I'll confess right away that I wasn't able to upload my desk. So very kindly, the organizers are going to progress the slides. So this is working group 1, which is families and communities. Next slide, please. And we very quickly focused in on education. Education is, I mean, obviously important. We had a prime minister that said education, education, education was the purpose of the government. It's become more important because for those of you that are environmentalists, which I hope is everybody, we can no longer have population grow, which means we need throughout the world more educated population rather than more bodies. Equality depends vitally on how we're handling education across the social classes. And finally, the pandemic is a reset opportunity. So far, sadly, most of the reset in England anyway has been in a negative direction, writing off a generation from the pandemic. That will hopefully change. The other thing where it intersects particularly with LGBTI plus is education and sexuality has become sort of a front line of illiberal governments. You know who they are and you know what they've said. I'll give relatively innocuous example of the UK of Section 28 under Margaret Thatcher, which was an early example of prohibiting the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities, including schools. That was abandoned in the UK, thankfully, but the governor of Florida decided it was such a good idea. It's reappearing in Florida. This focus on sexual minorities obviously has an impact on them, as well as the broader population being exposed to illiberal approaches. Next slide, please. So the challenge in the data that Anna already referred to in the UK, we'll talk about the UK where I know the issues much better. The Office for National Statistics is adamantly against asking anyone under 16 about their sexuality or gender identity. There's caution advised on asking anyone under 18. For UK government surveys of adults, luckily for the last nearly 2 decades, they've been putting this into surveys. As Anna pointed out, there are a lot of problems of non-answering and inaccurate answering, which will be more extreme in younger individuals whose educational experiences we particularly want to ask about. Younger individuals are also, we believe, more likely to be fluid in sexuality and gender. Next slide, please. Some things have already been done with the data that we do have. We have cohort studies that have asked people up to age, I think, because they edit the questions for different cohorts at different points. People who are 40 have been asked, what's your sexual orientation? You could apply that retrospectively because it's panel data. People are asked every 7 years about their experiences going back to when they were quite young. So you can apply retrospectively what we've now learned about their sexuality. Doing this, people at University College London have found that bullying is twice as likely among sexual minority youths. No surprise to anybody. It continues into adulthood. What is going to be particularly exciting in about 3-4 years, maybe 5 years, is there are plans to link the UK census, which asked sexual orientation and gender identity, with the LEO data set, which is longitudinal education and tax benefits data. This will be amazing when it happens in a few years' time, but people can prepare now, like how to use this data once it becomes available. Next slide, please. This is where I beg for people's help. This is an under-researched area, partially because of the lack of data. We put out a call on the Holocaust Network. We've had limited response. If you want to be involved, if you know anyone that wants to be involved, if you've researched on this, please just drop me an email. You can find me. I work at Royal Holloway College, j.frank, am I allowed to say this, at rhul.ac.uk. Next slide, please. Higher education is something that my team has a particular interest in. We've written a book on it. We have been looking in the first instance at Black students, and you find, interesting results. Black students are now more likely than white students to go to university, but they go to the wrong universities. They're mismatched into universities, and they're mismatched into subjects. There is also a persistent awarding attainment gap. So we would like to take the work that we've been doing on Black and other minority ethnic students and then apply it to sexual minorities. Next slide, please. So the sort of issues we're starting to look at for minority ethnic, and hopefully we'll be able to look at for sexual minorities, is do they do the same degrees? Do they go to the same universities as heterosexual students? Do they achieve the same outcomes? Are they as likely to complete their degrees? I mean, we all have reason to believe, anecdotally and otherwise, that sexual minority students are more likely to still be bullied, even at university level, and have some difficulties that are not shared necessarily with heterosexual students. Next slide, please. Other things where we have hypotheses, maybe gay men do more humanities studies at A level in university and less STEM. Maybe lesbians do the reverse. That's one of the things we want to look at. Do sexual minority students, particularly gay men, perhaps go to university in London? Do they get more education? There is evidence from studies we and others have already done that one way of combating anticipated discrimination when you get a job is get more education. Do a master's, do a PhD. And as we said, does discrimination lead to lower outcomes, particularly at schools? We know it leads to problems. We know it leads to suicides. Does that carry on post-18? Next slide, please. Methodology. One of the things we're really keen to do, and this is partially because this network encouraged us to do it, and we met people in other fields than economics, is go beyond data sets. Economists have become totally wedded to large-scale administrative data, which has many strengths, but particularly for this subject, is there are problems with this because of low response rate. We're not sure whether the response rates are accurate, and because sexual minorities are a small percentage of the population, say 3%, any errors in the variables can really distort the results you get. So we thought the way around this, and also to understand what was going on between you and me, sorry if there are any economists in the room, economists have become wedded to data manipulation and not doing enough thinking of models, thinking of what's going on. So broadening the methodology to other subjects should help us to do that through surveys, focus groups, and structured interviews. We've already said that's almost certainly going to have to be over 18 in the UK because the ONS has just basically told us not to talk to anyone under 18. How do we identify individuals? That's a problem, as you all know, who may have worked in this area. And we're hoping, for example, to use student union organizations. Next slide, please. This is early stages here. Again, I am appealing. I don't know why I didn't put my email there. Please get in touch if you're doing any work, if you're interested in this area. Next slide, please. That was the last slide, and hopefully I've stuck within my time limit.
So I would like to talk about what we do in the second work group, which is very much about the labor market. And now, of course, my screen doesn't work anymore. So that is nice to see. And what we basically look at is the labor market and the broader sense of socioeconomic well-being, where we look at many aspects of the different communities within the LGBTIQ community, and how on all these different dimensions they experience basically different trajectories in their life. What we do, and I think this was Christina already highlighted this very much, is that a lot of the movement and a lot of the say mobilization and the emancipation has been about presenting all kinds of obstacles that LGBTIQ communities face. It's sort of social-cultural problems. It's about tolerance, about modernity. But we are looking really at structural socio-economic sources of inequality and injustice. And in the proposal, we also say that often problems in the labor market and in people's basically work trajectory are individualized, but we're looking also at the structural factors that actually come into play. There is this myth of gay affluence, which is caused by a small part of the gay community who might be well off, but there is a lot of variation within the LGBTIQ community in terms of their access to material resources and labor market careers. And so we're looking at particularly what happens when people in early life already, particularly in the formative years, what happens when you are being discriminated or you feel you cannot come out, you cannot be yourself. And we think this has an enormous impact on the mindset of people, but then also that mindset and those feelings of rejection or even harassment might impact substantially on, say, your general well-being, but also on your access to employment and other financial economic resources. And those that limited access due to these early experiences are often ignored in the debate. And so we want to focus on the economic sort of underpinning of what goes on in the different communities of the LGBTIQ community. And so we want to go beyond what is important maybe for the more privileged is this legal protection, and we want to look into those really say hard economic obstacles that people are facing in terms of poverty, homelessness, unemployment, but particularly also precarity in work. Because what's often studied is, of course, access to the labor market, but also inside the labor market, inside your job, you can be very precarious. And we know that the economy matters for LGBTIQ emancipation. So we focus particularly on the stratification effects on the diverse genders and sexualities within our community. And so we know that there is wealthier countries more acceptable to homosexuality, but still within those wealthier countries, you can still have enormous gaps and problems in terms of socioeconomic well-being of different groups within the LGBTIQ community. We know, for example, this was also mentioned, that homelessness is actually quite frequent among LGBTIQ people when they come out. They had the interesting, or maybe more specific, problem of being LGBTIQ is that when you emancipate, you basically grow up in often a rather hostile, or at least an environment where you can't find role models. Other minorities might find, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, might find people who are good role models. They look like them, they are like them. But oftentimes we see in the life stories of LGBTIQ people is that that's early stage in life that they don't find these role models, that they live in a straight world as a LGBTIQ person, and this really impacts on, say, their development of their lives. And due to these often hostile environments, the bullying at school, the parents that might not accept them, there's a lot of real high level of precarity among LGBTIQ groups at an early age. But also we see very, very strong differentials in the different groups within the community. We find that in general, LGBTIQ people have a higher poverty rates, but particularly transgender people and the women inside the LGBTIQ community have much higher poverty rates than gay and straight men. And interestingly is also the high poverty rate of bisexual people in the group. But then also, even when people enter the labor market, even when people make a career, you have an enormous chance, is what is being reported in our research, of discrimination in work, of feeling that you cannot follow the same career path as your colleagues. This is in school already, but also in the workplace that we're really looking at. And we're not even talking about, of course, the more deeper well-being is that this impact of discrimination early in life also leads to high suicide rates among LGBTIQ communities. And also we are looking at how geographically there's also some divergence, because people who grow up in more rural settings or less urban settings, not close to, say, more accepting or open communities, they report even higher levels of economic precarity and psychological stress, and therefore obstacles in order to become a successful citizen. And we also did a study where we also included people with disabilities, and we found very strong effects that there's a sort of epicenter, a sort of Bermuda triangle of where precariousness is really low and well-being is really declining. And so we focused in some studies. I'm going to not speak too long because we're already over time and I want to be able to ask some questions, but we did a small study where we asked people within the LGBTIQ community by snowballing and targeting, and we have quite, I think, a good distribution of those people. We found that especially being female, non-cis, being queer, non-white, and disabled strongly predicts that you feel discriminated. This really has an impact on your feeling of precariousness, on your economic well-being. And those people who experience that discrimination really place themselves lower on the social ladder, especially when they experience discrimination. And so what we say, if you look at an intersectional, so Bermuda Triangle has as where you have people who are LGBTIQ and have report a lower health, also mental health, and then also even if they have say are part of a minority, that is really where precariousness and low well-being is reported. So we're looking at this wide range and we're trying to see what are the obstacles of people for having a successful economic life. And so we've done small, this is a small study in a very regional a province, we did a national study, we did across national, and we, like Jeff also said, we have problems in terms of course, recruitment of respondents, because we're looking at a small group in society, also a group that sometimes hides, that doesn't want to come out, that is not easily identified, is not easily targeted, or can't be interviewed because they're too young. And so we're facing enormous problems, obviously, but I still think that this group is very worthwhile. I also want to thank for the sponsors of this group. It is super worthwhile. We are doing amazing stuff. We have a really nice group, and I think we will make some stride in this field. So with that, I would like to give it back to the chair.
Okay, hope you can all see the presentation. Good morning also from my side. Now I can't click through the presentation. Wait a second. Yeah, now it's working. Okay, so good morning. I'm the co-leader of Working Group 3 on Social and Legal Inclusion, and I'm trying to manage this working group together with Maria Isabel Romero Ruz from Spain, and I'm a political scientist, and I'm currently based at the University of Kassel in Germany. So just a few words about this working group. I think as the title of the working group already suggests, it's a very large and it's a very diverse working groups regarding research interests and disciplinary background. So this is also a challenge for us as working group leaders. So we have a lot of disciplines in our working groups, so from political science to literature studies, from psychology to gender studies to cultural studies, educational sciences. So it's really very different disciplines who want to work on this question of social and legal inclusion. This is also why in our working group, we somehow don't work just on one topic, but we try to somehow form research clusters. And in the last 2 years, we identified somehow 4 main topics or 4 main research strands in our working group, so that we can really focus on different topics and that we can really reach the goals of the whole action. So the first one is what we identified, and this is not somehow a really special particular topic, but this is a topic that is somehow cross-cutting or cross-sectional. So we are all working together on this first one. This is theoretical concepts and methodological contestations of LGBTI plus inclusion. So the question, how is LGBTIQ inclusion being measured? And I will say a few words about that a bit later. The second topic is focused on the complex relationship between the state governmentalities and LGBTI plus inclusion. So we asked the question, inclusion into what? So when, especially I am as a political scientist, I'm of course always interested in the modulating form of the state and how state governmentalities also shape LGBTI plus inclusion, so that we really look into different LGBTI plus inclusion policies. And so this is our second main research strand. The third one is concerned with the question of inequalities among the LGBTI plus community, and also how inclusion policies affect the community in different ways. So we are concerned and looking into intersectionalities and particular vulnerable groups within the LGBTI plus community. And I will also say about all the 4 things more in a moment. And the fourth strand is about also activism, historical genealogies, and the shifting dynamics of LGBTI plus inclusion. So what we have been discussing in our working group is, of course, that we have a very contested and a very diverse history of LGBTIQ plus activism among Europe, and that also the terminology, the policies within activist movements are changing. So we have to look at the, entanglements between state policies and activist policies, and also how these kind of entanglements shape the question of LGBTI plus inclusion. So when we come back to our first research cluster, the question of how to measure or how to conceptualize LGBTIQ plus inclusion, we started from a discussion or from researching and also looking into current developments with regard to LGBTIQ plus inclusion. And this is the what we have discussing was the current judicialization and juridification of LGBTI plus policy making. This is a terminology that comes widely from sociology and political science. And it means that LGBTIQ plus inclusion is currently mainly discussed with regard to rights, so that we have on a policy level, we have a strong focus on rights as indicators of LGBT inclusion. And this is, of course, being problematized within critical LGBTI plus research. A second development, what we can also observe on a policy level, we can look at the EU, we can look at the OECD, but also on the World Bank level, is that LGBTIQ plus inclusion is mainly framed as access to institutions and rights that have formerly been restricted by heteronormativity. So when we look at, for instance, marriage, same-sex marriage is being regarded as a milestone in LGBTIQ plus inclusion. But what we can see, it's rather an opening of institutions that were limited, for instance, to heterosexual relationships, are now opened up to same-sex relationships. So these two developments are being contested, of course, in critical LGBTIQ research on different levels and from different angles and from different disciplinary backgrounds. And I just named here 5 critical approaches and contestations of these current developments that we have been discussing in our working group. So the first one, and this is really a focus also of our working group, is that this kind of judicialization or this juridification of LGBTI plus policy making tends to focus on individual forms of discrimination. So we have some people in our working group, including myself, who work on hate crimes and discrimination, also on hate speech. And there we have identified this kind of victimization frame versus the enablement frame. So the question is, how and why do this kind of LGBTIQ inclusion policies mainly focus on individual forms of discrimination? What does this do with LGBTIQ plus individuals? And how this can be also related to our kind of new forms of economic policies, for instance, neoliberalization of the welfare states. And so what does this mean when we mainly discuss inclusion in terms of individual rights? Another topic is, of course, and this is a long topic also in queer studies, that this kind of, when LGBTIQ plus inclusion becomes framed as access to institutions that have formerly been restricted to heteronormativity, that of course this kind of heteronormative forms of living serve as a criteria for inclusion. So it's the question of inclusion into what? So this is also a question that we are discussing a lot in our working group, so that this kind of the flexibilization of heteronormativity can be regarded or is very much linked to policy debates on LGBTIQ plus inclusion. This, of course, leads to an invisibilization of structural heteronormativity and precarity. So when we have a focus on individual rights, the question of, the normality of heteronormativity becomes very much invisibilized, and also precarity that is being produced by this kind of structural heteronormativity. Two more topics are the questions of how do rights rather serve as a kind of political rhetorics, for instance, on a European level, and new instruments of boundary markers. When we, for instance, look at the current debates between the EU and Russia, for instance, LGBTIQ rights serve as important new boundary markers to say who is, a modernized country, who is being perceived as a backward country. So it's been written also into foreign policies. So this is also interesting how rights become framed as boundary markers, and that what's getting lost is, of course, the question of who has really access to rights. So the questions of substantial rights. That is also a topic we discuss here. And this kind of, judicialization and juridification of LGBTIQ policy making also produces, of course, new forms of marginalization. So who is not able to fit into heteronormative forms, heteronormative institutions, the question of racism, the question of classism, the question of gender nonconformity, so that LGBTIQ inclusion also produces new forms of exclusion. So this is a topic that inclusion does not always mean inclusion for all parts of the LGBTIQ plus community. So following from that, what we are discussing in our working group is, of course, alternative concepts and more context-specific methodologies and research on LGBTIQ lives. So we, for instance, work with the term citizenship or substantial citizenship, or there's a new, concept, a life worth living, that has been developed in sociology. So we think of, is inclusion the best term, the best concept, somehow to measure, to conceptualize discrimination, precarity, and marginalization. The second strand, or the second research cluster of our working group, is the question of state and state policies. So we are asking, how are states promoting or complicating, preventing LGBTI plus inclusion through particular policies, through particular governmentalities, and how can inclusion be conceptualized from a more context-specific perspective? And currently we have somehow two subgroups within this question. So one is that we are looking into the after effects of political regimes on LGBTI plus inclusion. So how do, for instance, fascist dictatorships have kind of an after effect on how LGBTI plus inclusion is framed and experienced? We have people from Spain and Portugal who are working on that. And another topic or subtopic within this research stream is to look at entanglements between LGBTIQ plus policies and social and welfare and economic policies. So I'm currently working with Crystal Stormhöhe, for instance, on a paper that looks at the entanglements between the neoliberalization of welfare states and LGBTIQ plus inclusion policies in Denmark and Germany. So how is the, a privatization of welfare policies, how does it become entangled with LGBTIQ plus policies? Another paper is also in preparation that tries to explain the absence and presence of homonationalism in different countries, and also looks onto the impact of Christian churches in Social and Eastern Europe, and how this also is related to LGBTIQ plus inclusion policies. The third research strand focuses on vulnerabilities and intersectionalities, and we are asking what parts of the LGBTIQ plus communities are being marginalized or left out from current policies and processes of inclusion. We are looking at which people are particularly vulnerable in specific contexts. And I think one very important topic here is a topic that also Karin Schönpflug is also here, is working on. It's on the effects of a legacy of marginalization and discrimination on the social and economic status of LGBTIQ plus people. So how, for instance, did the constant precarization and marginalization of LGBTIQ plus people affect age poverty? And for instance, lesbian and trans people are intersectionally discriminated. So how does this kind of legacy of marginalization also have a huge effect on age poverty? And there is also a paper in preparation to touches upon this topic. And I'm coming to an end. So we have our fourth research strand focuses on movements, on historical genealogies, on activism. And I think what is really interesting here is how do LGBTIQ plus movements also negotiate or address LGBTIQ plus inclusion and discrimination? And what kind of historical dynamics do we observe with regard to that? So there are and there have been large and huge policy and frame changes within the LGBTIQ plus movement. And we have, for instance, one researcher from Turkey who also works on this, so-called human rights turn in the 1990s, so that we have a huge frame change in the LGBTIQ activism or movements, so that the frame change from transformation to inclusion. And for instance, the scholar from Turkey focuses on the LGBT movement in Turkey, looking at specific also journals and specific publications, how these changes occurred in the movement, and also what does it do to the movements to use a rights framework instead of a transformation framework? Why did this occur? How did this occur? And what kind of dynamics can we observe with regard to these topics?
Highly problematic, because we already know that even in countries where LGBTIQ people are relatively well protected legally, we still see similar problems in terms of early life development and in terms of discrimination, bullying. And so imagine that even then in regimes, in contexts where these rights are being violated. And also please note that increasingly they are violated. That the resurgence of the right, and especially the extreme right, the rhetoric that you see now coming from, for example, people like Putin, and this an online sort of bullying, there's a real push against trans people, and this fuels into the debate and increases, of course, the feeling of being marginalized among LGBTIQ communities, especially when you're young. This is super impactful and highly problematic. And so how are we dealing with this? Well, I think researchers highlight these problems, and they highlight the effects of those kinds of rhetorics, of those kinds of structures that are there. And we hope and we wish that, first of all, we collect better and more data in the EU, because the data is really lacking. And then from that, we can identify where are the problems, where are the deepest problems in terms of well-being, marginalization, discrimination, and we can tackle them. but it's clearly that we're rowing against a very, very strong current, and it's not going in the right direction at the moment. And therefore, I think this highlights the importance of this group, and also the importance of not stopping after this group is done in what is a year or so, but really to have a follow-up, because we can see that authoritarian, anti-gay, anti-LGBTIQ forces are gaining strength everywhere, also in so-called safer, nicer countries.
Yeah, I want to also, I totally agree with Andre. I think what I would like to add here is that I think what we do is to make very precise research in a way, and the context-specific research, because in the popular debate and also in policy debates, the question of anti-LGBTIQ rights movements and also in Central and European Europe are often framed with regard to backwardness. You know, it's the East versus the West. It's, you know, anti-gender movements are often being, you know, discussed as a step backwardness. And I think from a political science or social science perspective, this is really problematic because it's a new kind of policy that is emerging here. And I think we have to look in the entanglements also between a so-called Europeanization of LGBTIQ rights, so that in the last 10 to 15 years, LGBTIQ rights have been so much tied to the European Union, and that they have become Europeanized, and that also kind of backlash and a kind of movements who argue against LGBTIQ rights also frame their anti-European mobilization with regard to LGBTIQ rights. So we have to really precisely look into how are LGBTIQ rights being mobilized, and develop framework that do not, you know, focus on this kind of backwardness narration. And I think also to look at entanglements. So how do also the change of economic policies after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, also how did they affect, or how have they affect gender policies and LGBT policies? So when we have cuts of welfare, of the welfare system and welfare rights, so what does this mean that the Catholic or Orthodox Church jumps in? So people speak of a re-religionization of the Central and European context. So what does religion really mean with regard to economic and welfare policies? So what kind of role do they play? So really precisely look into these different actors and speak of political homophobia. So homophobia or anti-LGBTIQ violence is a political strategy. So, and not always frame kind of homophobia as a kind of, you know, this is a backward culture, whatever attitude, but it is a political strategy. And I think to develop new methodologies, I think will really bring us forward to explain this kind of developments also in the European Union.
Thank you, Christine. Maybe I can go to the second question, or did somebody want to add to the first question? Great. I'm Karen. I'm sat in Vienna, in Austria. And in Vienna, we also have the European Fundamental Rights Agency. And they're doing very good work in researching a large scale great numbers of LGBTIQ people in Europe. And how are they doing it? As you're saying in your second question, how do you find people that are hidden? How can you do research on them? And the Fundamental Rights Agency, they're really pioneers. They're starting the third wave of research on the well-being of LGBTIQ populations. And in the last wave, they reached 140,000 people in Europe. That's a really large number. So obviously it's possible to reach them. And you have to understand that the research that the Fundamental Rights Agency are doing is linked to online surveys. So people are invited to answer questions online, and this is a snowball sampling process where, you know, I may answer that online questionnaire, and then I know Christine, so I will forward it to Christine, and Christine sends it on to Andre, and so on and so on. Of course, it's better to do that on a more institutionalized level. So the Fundamental Rights Agency is doing that research in cooperation with LGBTIQ political associations, groups that are regional and national. So if you're on the national or regional level, you will have better access to communities, even though the communities might not be on the legal spectrum. Say in Austria, it was illegal to meet for LGBTIQ people till the 2000s, right? But still, of course, there were community activist groups. So if you kind of know where people are, and if you know the organizations, then the snowballing sampling will work. Downside to online surveys with snowball sampling is, of course, other factors, for instance, age. If you want to research, for instance, on older lesbian women or older gay men, older trans people, older inter people, the internet usage of older generations is not the same as for young generations. So you will have a huge age bias in your survey. Also, a lot of the data is collected via apps that may be used more by gay guys than lesbian women, which will bring you gender bias. And then also you have educational bias, because the media to reach the people will bring you more people who have university backgrounds and so on and so on. So to complement these snowball samples with online surveying, it's necessary to go back and to actually do the legwork and go and ask the local institutions where are people to find. Then you will have to pick up a telephone, or we'll have to do personal interviews, especially if people are old, if they are vulnerable, if they can't move. So, for instance, in the last year, we did a large study for the European lesbian and trans inter community. And we actually went around and we did interviews with people that are hard to reach, because there's very little known about older lesbian women, and you have to make sure that the method of data collection actually fits the research question. Otherwise, you're not going to be representative. But it is possible. You just have to know your field very well. And this is what Anna was saying at the start, that surprisingly, not only LGBTIQ researcher researching LGBTIQ communities, but also cis straight people might be doing that. And very often the access is even harder for these type of researchers.
So there's something of an overproduction of Scandinavian studies, which may not be representative of even Europe. Apparently, Scandinavia is a much better place to live. So other than that, I think Karen will correct me if I'm wrong, is there's starting to be Austrian data.
Not particularly great at the moment, so we're still waiting.
No, I think that's the problem, is even when you get data, and it's a problem when you try and analyze data from another country, because a lot of the imperfections in the data may be specific to a particular country, which is why we've been trying to link with the Office for National Statistics to talk to them about how they've collected the data, how they came up with the particular questions that they put on the census. The questions that they put in the census were very compromised in nature. So they may not have asked the questions particularly about gender identity in the way that people who are trans may have wished that they had been asked.